Hello everyone, and welcome back. I'm glad you joined us for our study through Numbers chapter 15. Hopefully you've read the chapter already, so you're familiar with it. This is just intended to be an outline. We've got the free PDF outline that you can download on our website if you're interested in that. And let's jump into our main characters for this chapter. You're going to be somewhat familiar with these guys if you've been studying with us. First of all, we have Moses. He is the leader of the Israelites, selected by God. Then we have the Israelites. These are the people who, they grew into a very large nation back when they were slaves in Egypt, and they were the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they were on their way to the Canaan land, which God had promised to give them as a home. And then we have a group of characters known as strangers or sojourners. We've talked about them back in the book of Leviticus. The Bible uses the word strangers to describe foreigners, or people who weren't descendants of the 12 sons of Jacob, who lived amongst the Israelites, both in the wilderness and in the land of Canaan. Jumping down to our when section, it appears that the laws that are recorded in this chapter were communicated to the people during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Remember, they had been punished to wander in the wilderness for 40 years because the spies had spied out the land for 40 years, or for 40 days, and they had brought back a faithless report. So the Israelites were in the wilderness from approximately 1490 to 1450 BC. Then as we look at our map, for a while the Israelites had been camped in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh, but God told them to turn around and to go back into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. And they were going to be in that wilderness for, as we mentioned, 40 years. Alright, so now let's go through an outline of chapter 15. Verses 1 through 21 talks about laws for sacrificing. The first section of Leviticus 15 is reminiscent very much of the book of Leviticus because it contains very specific instructions as to how the Israelites were supposed to offer their sacrifices. So we're told that when the Israelites entered the land of Canaan and offered burnt offerings, whether for a vow that had been made, as a free will offering, as a peace offering, or an offering on a feast day, their offerings were supposed to be accompanied by a few things. First of all, flour mixed with oil, and also an offering of wine. And the quantity of these offerings depended on the animal that was being sacrificed. Okay, so get ready for some detail here. If the individual was offering a lamb, along with that lamb, they were to offer 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/4 of a hin of oil and 1/4 of a hin of wine. If it was a ram that was being offered, they were to offer 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/3 hin of oil and 1/3 hin of wine. If it was a bull that was being offered, they were to offer 3/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with 1/2 hin of oil and 1/2 hin of wine to accompany that bull. Now, these sacrificial instructions were supposed to be kept not only by the Israelites, but also by any strangers or any sojourners who lived among the people and wanted to make an offering to the Lord. God also instructed the Israelites to make an annual offering of the first of their dough from their grain harvest. And then we're told in verses 22 through 31 about sacrifices for unintentional sin. So if the entire congregation of Israel sinned somehow unintentionally, and they later learned about their guilt, they were to sacrifice a bull as a burnt offering and a male goat as a sin offering to make atonement. If one person sinned unintentionally, so an individual, and later learned about their guilt, they were to offer a female goat a year old as a sin offering. Now, a person who willfully and rebelliously broke God's law, the text says with a high hand, right, or just out of pride, knowing that they were doing something wrong, that person was to be cut off from their people in Israel. After all these sacrificial instructions, we read about a man who is punished for breaking the Sabbath day law, verses 32 through 36. So one day, a man was seen picking up sticks on the Sabbath day. And if you remember, ordinary work was forbidden on the Sabbath day. It was supposed to be a day of rest. Moses asked God what should be done with this man because evidently he knew the law and he broke it intentionally. God told the Israelites that they were to stone the man because he didn't respect God's law. So God's law is to be taken very seriously. There's an application from that one. And then finally, tassels of blue. This is verses 37 through 41. God instructed the Israelites to sew tassels on the corners of their clothing and to add a cord of blue to each tassel. And God said that, quote, "And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and to remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes." And so it is something unique to the Israelites to remind them of their unique relationship with God and His laws. All right, now let's talk about our application. Humans need physical reminders to help them recall spiritual truths. God knew this about human nature, and He ordained several physical objects and ceremonies as reminders in the Old Testament. We see this in the tassels that God prescribed for the Israelites' clothing. We see reminders in like the rainbow that God gave to Noah, in the feasts that the Israelites were supposed to keep them to remind them of things like the Passover. Evidently, modern disciples really aren't all that much different. Human nature hasn't changed that much because God has given us physical observances to keep so that we remember spiritual lessons. This is one of the reasons that the early church was instructed to observe the Lord's Supper regularly. It reminds us of Jesus' sacrifice for us. We tend to forget things easily. God knows this about us, and so God uses the things in His creation to remind us. So in light of that, let's be careful not to neglect the memorials that God has put in place for our good.